to the Along the Gravel Road podcast, where we're changing the conversation around mental health. I'm your host, Chelsea Verona. Today's guest, we're going to continue the conversation around maternal mental health, so I'm really excited to welcome Neva Butkus. You may not think that taxes, motherhood, and postpartum issues intersect, but you'd be wrong. Neva Butkus is a tax policy analyst with the Institute on Taxation and Economic Policy, where she studies and advocates on progressive tax issues that lift up workers and families. She's also a new mom, being confronted with how societal expectations and public policy choices make the lives of parents, and especially mothers, more isolating and difficult than necessary. Before we jump in, I do want to talk about an amazing production company that is producing this podcast, Ray Media Group. If you're looking for a company that can deliver an amazing product and an experience, then Ray Media Group is who you need to call. They specialize in weddings, podcasts, commercials, YouTube, business promotions, and it's really been great to work with a company who strives to create this experience for their clients. And so you're not just a number to them. They take the time to build these relationships. Trust me, I know from experience. We've been working together for a little bit now, and it's been amazing. And they put up with me, which is a great thing. So you can check out their website at raymediagroup.com. That's RHEA mediagroup.com, or give Ken a call at 225-772-7504. Hello, Neva.
Hi.
Thanks
Happy
so
to
much.
be here.
Thanks so much. We're excited to have you. As we kind of continue this conversation around maternal mental health, we had an expert on a few weeks ago, a psychiatrist, talking about sort of that end of things. But I really love your perspective, and I'm really excited to dig in.
Yeah, it's definitely, the perspective is fresh and ongoing and changing every day. But yeah, happy to share my experience and especially how it connects to kind of the larger world of public policy and even taxes. So
Yeah, which is definitely exactly like when you said in your bio, it's like that's not something you necessarily think about. And to be able to have these conversations, I think, are really important because it is really, obviously maternal mental health in general obviously affects a large portion of the population. I don't know the percentage of how many pregnant people there are or how many moms there are. However, obviously it's a lot of people. And there's such an intersection between all of these topics, and to just sort of put it in a silo or not worry about it at all is detrimental to everyone and everything. So I'm really excited to touch on all of these things. So let's just start with just your journey and kind of see where that takes us. You want to share a little bit about yourself and your experiences and what you're going to mainly be touching on today.
Yeah, absolutely. New mom to a almost 10-month-old baby girl. She's amazing. And I guess the first thing I kind of like start off these conversations with when talking about like the bigger picture is like, I'm saying everything today from a very privileged perspective. I have like incredibly good healthcare through my profession. I got 15 weeks of paid maternity leave. I just like, my husband and I together have like a combined income that would be considered like quite high in the state of Louisiana. We are in a position to, really like cover the, basic necessities for our kid and for our homes, our home and our livelihoods. But, even at that level, you see the like pervasiveness of some like the systemic issues surrounding motherhood and mental health and just, society in general and how we're making things harder on all of us. And it only gets harder for people most of the time that aren't me. So I kind of want to start from that part. My journey through mental health as a pregnant person, I'd say it was like pretty typical. I was really fortunate not to have any postpartum issues, but one of the things that we chose to do, my husband and I are both big advocates of mental health resources and, just destigmatizing any issues around mental health. But we chose maybe around my third trimester, we decided that it'd probably be best if I started seeing a therapist for the first time in my life at that point in time. And one of the reasons we chose that is because I had a lot of friends who experienced postpartum depression. And one of the things that they told me was that like once they realized they were in it, it was really, really hard to pull themselves out. And they were oftentimes the last person that could really recognize it was happening. Like their partner could see it, their family could see it, but like when you're trying to keep this like human being alive and all the stress and like sleeplessness and whatever that surrounds that, it's really hard to like see, to like pull yourself up out of it from this like 50-foot view and like objectively see what's going on and how you're approaching things. And we also knew, George, my husband, was going to also be like losing sleep and stressed and trying to keep this tiny human alive that he's loved more than anything in this entire world. And like he can't be my therapist through that too. So we chose around my third trimester. Let's just get a baseline established. Let's start talking to somebody. And yeah, I mean, that was just like that was kind of my first, I guess, like one-on-one interaction with like the mental health world, if you put it. And it was great. It was someone to talk through, the stresses of motherhood with, and someone to talk through the stresses of, whether it was breastfeeding, whether it was going back to work, and, all those things. Yeah, I had someone who was there beforehand and then afterhand to kind of like monitor the situation, postpartum, and knew who I was before I had the baby too. So they were there to be able to flag anything. Because another thing my friends who had experienced postpartum depression had said is that like the best thing you can do is like diagnose it early and get on medication as fast as you can. Because it might take a few tries or a few different, obviously there's this new drug, but that might not be the kicker for everybody. So, yeah, that way you can figure out what works for you, get your dosages right, and start feeling like yourself again, or as much as yourself as you can when you're like running on like, a couple hours of sleep at a time. But yeah, so that was kind of my journey in terms of the my personal mental health. And something I think we'll get into a lot today is just while my personal mental health in terms of like postpartum depression and everything, that was something I was fortunate not to encounter, but I often still found myself like upset and angry at just how we treat mothers and how our just kind of just the roles of society have like, kind of pushed on women in particular in terms of like what to expect and accept when it comes to postpartum life and raising kids. And yeah, so that's going to be a whole can of worms that I'm sure we'll get into today. So
yes.
yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm excited to jump into all of that. And I really like that you brought up this idea of that you were thinking in terms of prevention. So you set yourself up when you were in a good place just in case anything went wrong. And I think that could be applicable really sort of to any parts of our life, but especially to expecting something as intense as pregnancy and postpartum or a big change and shift in your life. Because just like you said, whether it's postpartum depression or, major depressive disorder, whatever you're dealing with, when you're in it, you are not the person to get you out of it. And if you don't have these conversations on the front end, or at least have like things set up to be able to recognize that you need support from other people in that moment, it can often set you up for even, just get worse instead of better. And so if your partner in this case did not know, that, or was not really on board with it, or was on the same page that these are some signs, these are some things to recognize. You said the family and the partners, they're the ones that are going to notice these things if they know what to look out for.
Right. And you're teasing out between like what are like the normal aspects of like your life that are changing that you're going to be like mourning and upset over versus like what is something like chemically now imbalanced in you that is like much deeper and darker. And because I mean like after you have a baby, your hormones just plummet. You have like the 6-month reserve of hormones that you've been building up while you've been pregnant, and pretty much overnight they just plummet. So the first week you find yourself just like I would just be like looking at my husband holding my daughter and just like start sobbing like out of nowhere. And the one thing my obstetrician told me, she was just like, I mean, like if you can like, if it's happening to you and you see it as silly, then like you're probably fine. It's probably baby blues. But even then, like baby blues are something that's completely normal. And that's just the emotions that come from the hormone dump. But it was like a little frightening because I'm not like a very like emotional person day to day, I would say. And so experiencing something like that was like very jarring to me. But I knew, luckily I had the like resources and knowledge at the front end to like know what to kind of expect. I mean, I didn't. You don't expect it until, or you don't know what it feels like until it's there. But like you at least are like kind of on the lookout for it, or when it starts happening, you're like, okay, the pieces are like starting to fit together. But that also just goes back to like the fact that like I was able to have, like I said, like I had the resources to seek mental health counseling beforehand. We had the resources to hire a doula for my pregnancy as well, who walked through a lot of those things. I had a healthcare professional that I really trusted, so I was able to have those open conversations. That's not the experience of every person and every every person who's pregnant, every mom, and so and yeah, it's different for everybody. But it doesn't have to be that different. So
Yeah, and I think also in terms of talking about what's normal to experience, even if it is normal to experience, we also still like to acknowledge that it is still very difficult, and and that having like reaching out for help or needing help, even going through the normal stuff during pregnancy, is okay. That doesn't mean make you a bad parent or a bad mom, which that's those thoughts that can really become intrusive and overwhelming.
Yep. No, absolutely. I think that we as a society tend to really shun the like hard parts of pregnancy and childbirth and like infant rearing. Like I know people that really enjoyed being pregnant. I was not one of those people, and I knew I wouldn't be. I didn't I didn't love it, and when especially at the end, physically it became like very tedious day to day. And you're in pain a lot, you're not sleeping very well, and you'd like mention it to people and they'd be like, oh, don't say you hate it. Like, don't say you're
gonna miss
like,
it.
Yeah,
It's beautiful.
yeah,
all
like
these
it's not helpful.
all things might be true.
Yeah,
and it's also miserable and painful and exhausting and very, very difficult, and sometimes feels impossible.
Yeah, there were nights where like at the very end, and just like the pain you'd feel in like your hips and your joints as you're like trying to go to sleep was just absolutely unbearable. And yeah, like it's not helpful to like dismiss anyone's frustration, and also just like, I mean, I guess as a society we don't like it makes people uncomfortable to hear when somebody talks about like, oh, this is hard, or I don't like it, or even that like I hate this part of pregnancy. And so yeah, people dismiss it because they don't know how to respond to it.
And that can feel very isolating.
Absolutely. Yeah. Yep. Yeah. Just, yeah. Anyone listening to this, just, sometimes a simple, like, wow, that sounds like it sucks. It's all people really need to hear. You don't need to try to make them feel better. Like, they're not going to feel better.
No, it's one of those things that you cannot take away the challenging part of this in most respects. And especially for the pregnant person, a lot of this they already have to go through alone. That is just how this works.
Yep.
And so, to try and, to try and sugarcoat it or make someone feel better with, the end result. Yes, a baby is a beautiful thing, and pregnancy sucks for some people.
Yep.
And childbirth sucks for some people.
Yep.
And you got the baby out of it, but shit.
Yeah. Yeah. And even like for some people, like not just sucks, but like is traumatic.
Yes.
Yeah. Is like a life altering experience, like not necessarily always in a good way. And yeah, there's no point in invalidating those people's experiences.
Well, because if not, if we do, imagine the person who did go through a traumatic birth. They feel like they can't tell anybody. They feel like they have to pretend like everything was okay because now they have this beautiful baby, and they should be grateful and all of these other things. But that just leads to more pain and more suffering if we can't acknowledge our traumas and then be able to get help with that.
Right.
And a lot of it is just saying, yeah, you did go through that, and everything you're feeling around that is incredibly valid.
Yeah, it's like bonkers to think that that pregnant person hasn't already like judged themselves 400 times for feeling that. Like,
Absolutely.
yeah, there
Yeah.
were plenty of times, especially early on, where like things would feel hard or like I would feel a certain type of way, and then you feel guilty for like feeling a
Feeling
certain
that.
type of way. Whether it's like reconciling with like something that didn't go the way you planned during childbirth, and trying to like wrap your mind around the vision that you had for that experience versus what actually came out of it. It could be that. It could just be like, I mean, there was a point in time, my first few weeks where I just like you feel like truly mournful over like the life that you used to have. And like, obviously when you're going to have a baby that things are going to change. Like you can't just drop everything and go to the gym. You can't just work late when you have a deadline that you want to, accomplish. You can't go get drinks with friends just because you feel like it, or even like not feel like it. Like you have a friend that's had a bad day and you want to be there for them. So you want to like those things don't exist in the same way anymore. Um, and it's perfectly normal to like feel some sort of like grieving over that like former life of yours and realizing that like for a long time your life is not cannot be that potentially ever again, but especially when they're young, there just isn't much, yeah, everything's different. I had someone recently, my husband had his 20-year high school reunion recently, and one of his former classmates' wives, we were talking, she had a 3-year-old and a 6-year-old, and she was talking about we were just talking about motherhood and everything and like how tough certain things are. And she told me, she's like, just wait till they're like 3. Like when they're 3 or 4, you're going to like wake up and like be like, wow, I kind of feel like myself again. Like everything's on autopilot, they're kind of more self-sustaining. Like, that might not be everyone's experience, but that was hers. But yeah, I mean, and that's with one kid, right? If you have multiple, like you're dragging that out. But yeah, I mean, your former life is no more, and it's okay to feel like upset about that simultaneously as feeling joyful about this new stage of your life.
Yeah.
So,
No, I'm so glad you brought that up. The part where you do have to essentially go through the grieving process while also dealing with a lot of the emotions and the confusion and the stress and the anxiety. So you're experiencing just really what most individuals can only deal with one thing at a time when it comes to a lot of these issues.
yeah.
And as a new mom, new pregnant pregnant individual, you're going through all of these things simultaneously on top of the chemicals in your body going haywire. Like I don't even know, what exactly that looks like. Yeah, I mean, and we, our society sort of just expects, because people with like that pregnant people or just women or in general are like made to do this. Like
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
is our
Yeah.
biological imperative to have this happen, that we're supposed to just be able and equipped to deal with it, or if we aren't, there's something wrong with us. Man, yeah, that's like the society side of things, which obviously I know you're an advocate for, and then within your work as well. Can you talk a little bit about that and kind of what maybe some of the things that you maybe didn't see now that you're a mom you really see?
Yeah. Yeah. So a lot of what I saw was like I mentioned earlier, like I felt a lot of anger, especially as like my maternity leave was wrapping up. Mostly because like, and I guess I'll start with maternity leave, right? Or just parental leave in general, as like when talking about more of like societal, expectations on mothers, and families in general. But, yeah, I had 15 weeks paid maternity leave. I work for an organization that really puts their money where their mouth is. And yeah, they also offered like 12 weeks minimum paid paternity leave for fathers. So, yeah, I was really fortunate in that aspect, but like I hate to call it fortunate because like the United States is the only developed nation in the world that doesn't have a state-sponsored parental leave program. Iowa, or Canada and most of Europe and all of these other nations are, families receive 3, 6, 9, 1 year, potentially more of maternity leave or at least like leave for the birthing parent. And the fathers will be able to like tack that on, or partners will be able to tack on an additional amount. They can split it. Some countries you can split it how you want to. Takes the non-birthing parent can like take some up front and take some at the end, like after the other parent goes back to work. However they want to like make it work for their lives, right? And in like a lot of countries in like Scandinavia, like even like with parental or paternal leave, you have to take it. It's not like optional. Like they say like, no, like you have like, 1 month, 2 months, whatever it is, it might be longer than that. This is mandatory. It's not optional for you to like opt out of this and like keep working. And they do that for just general like gender discrimination in the workplace, right? If that's the case, then like men can continue working through their wives being home with babies and continue hitting metrics and continue, getting promoted and making more money and like looking like they're really prioritizing the workplace while women are at home, keeping this human being alive and feel like they're missing out on professional opportunities, or kind of being like overlooked for professional opportunities. So yeah, they make men take it too. So I guess, yeah, bringing it back to just like general parental leave, right? So a few weeks into, so I guess I'll start with just like general U.S. parental leave policies, right? So companies of a certain size have to offer 12 weeks of unpaid parental leave, maternal leave, right? Like that's only for birthing parents. It actually doesn't apply to fathers. But yeah, they can offer 12 weeks unpaid. If you're under a certain size, you don't have to offer anything at all in terms of a guaranteed unpaid or paid parental leave. And, I know companies that have done, or organizations that'll do like 8 weeks, 6 weeks, something kind of like in the middle of nothing and 12. Which again, like, I feel like people feel like they have to feel fortunate over that. When most other nations, that's just like expected, and it's much longer than that. But there's a whole, there's a whole group of parents, typically with, very low incomes, lower wage workers, and particularly wage workers, right? People who are working for hourly wages, who don't have any access to any leave at all. And that could even include like PTO, right? Like actual like service industry workers, like there's no paid sick leave. There's no paid vacation time. There's nothing for them to tap into. That's really standardized. And you have, because of that, people returning to work after giving birth a week, 2 weeks, a couple days, maybe even, after giving birth to a human. And while I was in the thick of like the first few weeks, just thinking about what it would be like at that point in time to turn my like 8-pound infant over to a caregiver, whether it was like an aunt or a cousin. Most child care centers do not take them that young. 6 weeks is usually the absolute minimum. And then like go back to work while your hormones are plummeting. I had a C-section unexpectedly, and I was still healing from that on like intensive painkillers. I was in like incredible pain as your like nerves are repairing yourself along the incision line, that I wasn't expecting. Yeah, it's just like, I mean, I can't think of a better word except for like barbaric. It is barbaric that we as a country expect women or birthing people to take practically no time off after giving birth to somebody and then return. I like, actually, when you say it out loud, it like actually doesn't make sense. Like,
no, not even a little bit.
Yeah, not even a little bit. Like my husband works in a very male dominated field, he had a female colleague a few years ago who was giving birth and was telling my husband how she was really nervous to take a certain amount of time off. And my husband was like, I'm going to tell you what my wife would tell you. And that is that this company and all companies, I can swear on this, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, cool. Okay. All companies nobody's going to buy their shit in 18 years if you don't give birth to this human being right now. Like, it is an economic
driver.
imperative.
Yes.
Yeah, for us to have children. Like, not to call out specific companies, but, like in Baton Rouge, you think of like the big one, ExxonMobil, Chevron, whatever, like any large petrochemical company, any company at all, small business, large business, no one's going to buy your shit. You will cease to exist in like 18 years if nobody gives birth right now. The economy, if women stop getting pregnant, if people stop getting pregnant like this week, in every hospital in the nation, I think about this a lot actually, in every hospital in the nation, like a couple months from now was like, no one is coming for like an ultrasound in like a really long time. And they all started putting the pieces together. The economy would tank overnight. Like it should be owed to parents to provide a meaningful amount of time off in order for us to get our bearings, keep our mental health and physical health in order, and do what we need to do so that we can return to work like in one piece. That is what is good for the economy. Like, and by that I mean like the economy is in like the country as a whole, not like the top 1%,
right,
who is now, reaping profits over like not giving people maternity care. Yeah. Yeah, it's absolutely it's barbaric.
And it's still built on basically like when women when their jobs were to have babies and run the home, like it is still based around this idea that is our our role, and that's where we belong, and so it's so it's not even that it's outdated. It was always outdated. It's always to not. And when you really think about what it is that birthing people are doing for, like literally creating life, and we're just like,
right,
that's all right.
Right. Meanwhile, people are freaking out over like, we don't have enough people being born in this country to sustain Social Security.
Why do you think that is?
20 years from now. Yeah. Like, help people have kids. I know so many people that would have a second kid or a third kid if it was financially feasible for them.
As a single person, I would bring a child into this world tomorrow if it was possible, but it would not be possible the way that it's set up right now for me. Would not.
Yeah. It's, was it barbaric? I just can't say that word enough.
It really is. And I'm glad we're having this conversation, because even as we're talking about this, you start thinking about like the root causes of things. Until you get down to the root causes of things, all of these other issues are going to keep getting worse. So maternal mental health and like postpartum mental, like all of these things, until we can actually affect meaningful change for the systems in place, we're going to keep seeing these problems happen over and over through generations.
Yep. Nail on the head right there. I think there's a example I hear a lot in like the policy field, where they talk about like, if you had like a lake in your yard and like there's a fish, you find a fish that's like belly up in it and you're like, that's weird. And then like the next day you find like half the fish in your lake are dead. And you're like, that's really weird. Maybe something's wrong with my lake. And then you realize like all of your neighbors also have lakes where fish are like dying. You would start to question whether it was like the lake or whether it was like something like they usually like the groundwater is like usually the like term that they'll use it for like the analogy. That's really what I feel like we're seeing when it comes to maternal mental health. And obviously parental leave is like one important facet of that, but it goes beyond that heavily. Yeah, like you can't, we can create, like the new center opening up at Women's Hospital is, that's great. It's going to be like the first of its kind right in the state of Louisiana, I think. Like that's an incredible feat that we should be striving for in the state and across the country. But like you can't fix someone's mental health when they're making $7.25 an hour and they just had a baby and they're now trying to like do the math as to whether they need to go back to work in 3 days so that they can pay their rent so they're not evicted and on the street with an infant. Like those two things can't exist at one time. Like we have to create the systems that allow families to thrive. So like the parental leave is a huge piece of that. But access to quality healthcare is obviously a huge part of that as well. Like I said, I was really fortunate to have, I am really fortunate to have very, very good insurance at my work. Whenever we checked in to have the baby, and they like run your billing, they run your billing before you even go to the room. Like you sit at a desk and they go through your insurance and they like estimate how much you would pay. I was really fortunate to not pay anything to have a kid. And I asked them like, what is the average amount? And they were like, oh, like $3-4 grand probably. Like that's usually the bill that most people come out of the hospital with.
It's another one of those things like, why are we paying?
Yeah. Right. Like it's exactly. It's like, man, I heard, because I mean, we can talk about childcare too next. 'Cause that's another piece of all this. But like I saw someone recently, like maybe it was on TikTok or something. They were talking about how like, as like, in most countries, same with parental leave, childcare is heavily subsidized for families, like on like a big sliding scale. If you make a lot of money, maybe it's like 20% subsidized. If you have a very low income, it might be like 80%, even 100% subsidized. So it helps keep the industry afloat, childcare centers afloat, because any childcare provider who owns a facility will tell you that like making ends meet month to month is like near impossible, just because of the overhead. And how much you can actually charge parents that they would actually afford, just the numbers like don't line up. So, but the way this mom was talking about it was like in a country where like you put it on the parents, like we're subsidizing the childcare, like just like all of these companies need us to have babies for the economy to keep running. Childcare needs to exist for the economy to keep running. It's a public good. If childcare doesn't exist, you are going to have droves of parents, typically moms, drop out of the workforce. Child and the additional boosts for childcare funding ended yesterday through the federal government. During the pandemic, a lot of money was allocated to help keep centers afloat. That all ended as of yesterday. So they expect, I think, like, oh my God, was it 70,000 maybe like centers to close? It was thousands and thousands of childcare centers they're expecting will no longer be able to be operational because they can't keep raising their prices, because like we pay $900 a month for childcare in Louisiana, and that's like high for Louisiana, but it's low compared to pretty much any other state. I grew up in the Chicago area. It's not uncommon for my friends there to be paying $2,000 a month for childcare. In Louisiana, with a median household income of like $58,000 now, how can you ask parents to cough up half of that in childcare expenses pre-tax? Like,
right.
So, it's just I think when we think about a lot of these societal services that are being provided in other places, but not in the United States, and definitely not in Louisiana, the cost, they still get paid for it, but it just gets shifted over to us. And what that does is just create like drastically inequitable situations for moms and families and parents. You've got households like mine that can like cough up the cash and do what we need to do to stay afloat, and keep our household running day to day. And you have households that, are trying to decide whether they're going to like have groceries that week or like fix a car tire so their mom can keep working. And it's just, it's like in the richest nation in the world. Like what did we get this rich for? That's what I want to ask people too. Like what was the whole point of industrialization? What was the whole
Certainly not about what's better for humanity anymore.
Like what was the whole point of medical progress? Like what was the point of any of this if we can't just like allow people to have access to it so that we can all thrive. And
Because we could.
yeah,
There is a world
easily.
in which this is possible, and we've seen it in other places.
Everyone else seemed to figure it out, or a lot of other
And
people who could figure it out and had the resources to seem to have. So yeah.
exactly. And, it comes back to if there's a lot of people having to decide between childcare or going back to work and weighing those options. And then that's putting all this pressure on, a person, an individual to, I mean, obviously you're already making a ton of sacrifices, but the way things are set up, it's like the person that sacrifices the most is usually the birthing person, at the end of the day. And there's just, again, to be able to do something, to do that, which, again, is an imperative for everything to continue. And just to sort of be told, doesn't matter.
Yeah.
It really doesn't matter what you've done or, who you are. It's just... It's sad, honestly. And, it doesn't get any better with the healthcare system. I mean, as not a pregnant person, I'm struggling with insurance premiums and trying to just get procedures that I need. I spoke with my OB about, I kind of like breached the conversation around freezing eggs and like all of that, fertility is a whole nother space that there is. It is not accessible, not equitable in any means. And I asked, what would that look like for me? And she's like, tells me the age. I'm like, that's my age. She's like, okay, well, you could always get a loan to do it. A $20,000 loan to freeze my eggs, just in case maybe one day I am stable enough and in a good place to have children. It's wild.
Yeah. Yeah, and like you mentioned earlier how the parental leave thing goes back to these like archaic perceptions of like what a family is, and I feel like so much of that stems around this, whether it's like fertility treatments, like especially for, women who aren't married, like, there doesn't seem to be any like gumption by the from elected officials to like prioritize that.
It's still sort of like stigmatized to be a single mother,
right, yeah, so there's no interest in like supporting that side of things, especially when they are concerned about like population growth, whatever. And like I say all that as like somebody who works in economics, but like as someone who works in economics, like I think the idea that like the economy is the good of the economy, I frame a lot of this in the frame of like the economy, right?
Which that's what people
seem to care about and understand. But
and
like at the same time, people are like living, breathing human beings who like deserve to live like meaningful, full lives during their time on Earth. And like if we have the resources, whether or not it's good for the economy to like make that happen for them, then like why wouldn't you? Because like what is the point of living? We're all gonna die anyways. What is the point of doing anything if like we can't just do that, whether or not like it is like good for the economy, quote unquote. But so yeah, I wanna get that part of the way too.
Yes,
like I think people tie things to the economy, but like it also is just like good for humanity and just like the people living dignified lives.
And I think it feels like some of our progress is not progress in that regard. Like we're forgetting about the humanity piece a lot of times because we are so focused on power and growth and whatever else is considered progress in our current society.
Right. Total tangent, so I'm only going to like say a sentence or two on it. NPR this morning was talking about like the degrowth movement, which is basically like like throwing GDP out the window. There's like a whole movement of people that are like, we need to stop fixating on like consumerism as like a benchmark of progress and like focus more on like utilizing the resources we have to like develop societies that can like provide basic needs and services without like sacrificing that for like this growth and like whatever that tends to mean. So yeah, total. Anyone listening is interested in that. Yeah, NPR did a really good had a really good piece on it this morning. But yeah, so I guess where I was starting with all of this was there's gonna be a lot of tangents.
I know, right?
What I was starting with all this too is like kind of like the archaic perceptions, right? So we're talking about like fertility treatment. We were talking about parental leave and how like that is, oftentimes based in this like idea of like, oh, like well, like your husband should just be making money. You can't take time off. Like, what's wrong with you? Meanwhile, like men in this country's wages have like plummeted significantly. Unemployment for men is up significantly, because, when I was little, or like even my parents were in their 20s and 30s, like especially growing up in the Chicago area, there were so many like good paying, typically union jobs that like men were able to enter the workforce and provide for their family. That's what my grandfather did as a union electrician. And my mom was raised on like a mostly single parent household, or a single parent salary. Those don't really exist anymore. So like, yeah, like you can't, most women just can't like take off time in 12 weeks. Like that's a huge sacrifice.
And we are seeing more of non-traditional, like we aren't having two-person households or male-female, or like it's just, it doesn't look the same.
Like
and why are we
family
still
unit, this like hypothetical like nuclear family that we've all been obsessed with for decades?
Not real anymore. If it ever was, it's just not. And we shouldn't still be using these outdated policies for something that just doesn't look the same. And all it is doing is feeding into that to say like, okay, we're to again tell men or husbands that their connection and responsibility with the child, it looks different. They're not the ones that are going to have that connection. So to make those things feel like they're doing, that just when they do traditional parenting things, they're getting praised for it. It's all of that is still feeding into these outdated ideals.
I'd love to pivot into that if we're ready for it. The looks that my husband gets when he's carrying Eliza around in our little like baby, carrier that straps to him, like older women just like die when they see it. It's pretty, I mean, like, part of it's hilarious, part of it's, like, completely infuriating.
Well, it's just so ridiculous.
Yeah. And I mean, like, my dad was pretty involved with me as a kid. Like, he took me lots of places and whatever. And, like, there's, I think that was the step for a while, is, like, dads were like, oh, yeah, like, I'm going to be involved in, like, their sports or their extracurriculars and stuff. But there's still a whole segment of, like, responsibilities that like I think a lot of millennial women and millennial families are struggling with. I know George and I like had in like certain instances, like I'm still breastfeeding, going on 10 months, and like part of that is like somewhat involuntary. Like she doesn't want to take formula and she won't drink it. Like she'll eat literally, like she eats like smoked Russian fish packed in oil that my husband brings for her, but like she does not eat, she won't eat formula. It's the only thing she has ever spit out in her life. So I'm like kind of like I would love to be like somewhat combo feeding right now, and that's just not the choice. So there's just no way to like equal parent when one parent is exclusively breastfeeding. It's really, really hard. And I think a lot of millennial aged-ish couples, have also kind of been like waking up to like even before kids, right? Or like pre-children, or like whatever. Like you kind of like wake up to the idea when you live with your partner that like even, and my husband and I have talked about this ad nauseum, so like he's not gonna, I don't think he's gonna be angry with me bringing any of this up, but like, you recognize that like you're both equally career like ambitious. Like you both are like contributing professionally to the household. For many, many years my husband and I made like comparable income levels. And so, one person wasn't like the breadwinner necessarily for most of our relationship. And when it comes to like the management of the home though internally, that's something that still tends to be like a very big struggle, right? So and a lot of that, I think one of the best things that like we were able to do was like recognize when we get frustrated over those things is like it isn't necessarily like individual fault, and like recognizing it as that like you mentioned, that's like societal expectation of like this is what, these are what things that women manage in the household. These are the things that men manage outside of the household, like creeping in and showing up in the day-to-day lives of like managing our home. So, I'll hear women say like, oh, but he does the yard work. Oh, but that's not the same thing as like planning and executing the, feeding and like feeding, doctor's appointments, play dates, enrichment extracurriculars,
No.
and coordination with their teacher, buying school supplies for their classroom, making sure their
Right.
permission slip, like all of that.
There's a difference between splitting household things based on like what maybe you're better at and like can
or
do
enjoy
more
or
enjoy. Yeah, but when it comes to raising a child, it's not that.
Yeah.
It's not, oh, I mean, yeah, you can split up like, oh, bath time, you're so good at bath time, but you still need to both be play a big role in all of these things.
Yeah, and that's something we had to like discuss whenever I was ending my maternity leave, because like for those 15 weeks, like sure, it made sense for me to be point person for, all of the things regarding her daycare. When we thought daycare was going to fall through, I did all the coordination to like find a nanny. When all the coordination for her doctor's appointments, even though George would attend them, but like, I was doing all the back end stuff. Like I was managing her feeding. I was reading all the books on sleep training. Like I was doing all this mental labor to like keep our household moving with the kid now being an integrated part of it.
Right.
And so that's a conversation we had. I was like, well, when I go back to work, I can't be point person for all of this anymore. We have to find a way to divvy it up. And some weeks we're better at it than others. I think we'd both agree to that. And a lot of that I think like stems back to, like I said, like kind of societal expectations. And, I think a lot of millennial men do see themselves as, very like forward thinking individuals. Like they want their wife to work. They celebrate their wife's academic and professional achievements. I know my husband absolutely does that with me. But like there have been differences in like the expectations. And like when I say like how we were raised, I don't even mean necessarily like what your mother did or did not ask you to do, or like what your father modeled for you. Like those are pieces of it. But there's also, that societal like expectation creeping in of like, when there's a bunch of dust in the corner of the living room, who's the person that notices it? And then who's the person that notices it and grabs the broom to like sweep it up? Like those things like start to like creep in. And it's oftentimes like the women in the relationship who tend to like end up being default the person who kind of manages the day-to-day pieces of the household, just as they were as if they stayed home permanently. And research backs that up. Like over and over again, they show that while women are contributing more often than not, around 50% of household income in heterosexual, relationships, they're still doing the majority of the legwork when it comes to like keeping the household running, especially when there's kids at home. And so they often end up working like two jobs, know. One of my favorite studies too on this looked at men in like urban areas like New York and Chicago, where like they don't have yard work to do. Because like that's like the excuse you'll hear is like, oh, I do the yard work. Like she takes care of the inside of the house, I take care of the outside of the house. It's not any different when they don't have yard work. They're not automatically doing the grocery shopping then. Like it's so but no, that's a big part I think a lot of millennial couples are struggling with. And when you have a kid, it just like layers, so much of that on that, because, I know as George and I have like navigated how to approach those things and how to like, you have to be conscious about like divvying things up equally, because if you aren't conscious about it, it reverts back to the it just reverts back to like the like norm of like, of gender roles and that. So we have to be really, really conscious about like how we divvy up work. And I mean, it's really tough. But like when we aren't conscious about it, I feel to bring it back to like the whole point of this podcast, right? Like I feel my mental health being sacrificed.
Yeah.
Like, and it's hard because it's a lot for both of us to like take on all these additional responsibilities. But like, it's just when it starts creeping in, and I feel myself like really get overloaded with the responsibilities of raising a child, and keeping our household, moving and whatever on top of my professional life, like, those, I don't have time to like talk to my friends. I don't have time to like catch up with my family. I don't have time to like plan time for myself. Like, um, yeah,
Yeah,
like,
there has to be a lot more intentional conversations and planning around it and actually doing it, because if not, just like in the beginning, because at the beginning the birthing person is the one who has to sacrifice more. It is just, that's part of the process. But at a certain point, that needs to start balancing out, and if we aren't intentional about it, it won't.
yeah, yep.
Especially because it's both society and how things start off, and like knowing that as the partner that you don't have, you can't breastfeed, you aren't really able to do some of the things. But when things do start to become the opportunity for balance, or filling the part of it that you can fill, if breastfeeding is, obviously on the birthing person, then what can the partner take the some of the load off, and keeping that as a part of the ongoing, it's an ongoing conversation.
Yep.
And it starts with awareness.
It's still going on.
Yeah,
Like,
always will.
She's
Always will.
eating like solids for them, like pretty heavily now, and we like pack her like a little lunch for school every single day, and like I was managing all of that for like weeks, and I like at one point had to be like, George, like, you have to remember, like, I am the only one that can make the milk, but like I'm not the only person who can like plan her lunches week to week. So now after I like recognize that, he's like, no, you're right. Like, you are right. So now he usually like comes to the end of the day and is like, oh, we have that like half kiwi in the fridge. Like, let's cut that up for her lunch tomorrow, so we can get rid of it and like that. So, so like he's also like being active in the like planning through like, oh, we have this on hand. She needs, let's get a fruit and a starch, or let's get a dairy and a vegetable or whatever to like try to like balance out her little meals. But yeah, like it's much more of a team effort now.
Yeah, it has to be. And I think that kind of answers this question around like, what can we do as individuals to help sort of change some of these things? And a lot of it is becoming aware of what is a societal, what is and what is things that we can actually make an active change by being aware of it. And, whether the partner or the birthing person, what things can be put into place. And then in a larger sense, though, like when it comes to the inequity, when it comes to, a lot of that within the policy and taxes and these larger systems that maybe we as individuals don't have as much of an impact on, what can we do?
Yeah. Vote. Like, with like your life depends on it. And like, I feel like a big thing that drives me nuts in Baton Rouge is people like to vote for people that they know, and not people that necessarily align with their values. So stop doing that, please, everyone. Like, I vote for the people who want to enact the policies that you want to see change in this state. Because it's not going to happen if you just vote for people you like who don't actually believe in them or want them, like, and they're very explicit about that. So like, everybody please stop doing that, for the love of God. So obviously that's a big part of it. I think also though, just like, in addition to voting and like being more engaged in the policy side of things, like just like constantly connecting the dots between all of these things too, right? Like, I haven't talked about taxes much at this point, but like I think it's important to, talk about like, when I talk about my work, I often lead with like taxes are the building blocks to the societies that we want. We aren't going to like find some like magical like hack coupon whatever to like fix our roads. Like, we're going to have to pay for them. Same with our schools, same with our healthcare infrastructure, like same with societal programs like parental leave. Like there's no magic bullet. We just have to freaking pay for it. And taxes are how we do that. And there's a lot of different ways to tax people to make that happen. But in states like Louisiana and most states across the country, we rely on things like sales tax, which disproportionately ask way more of lower income households, paycheck to paycheck, as opposed to relying on income taxes. So when legislators start talking about, eliminating the income tax and things like that too, that's going to make these policies that I think a lot of people, I meet a lot of people who don't necessarily identify politically the same way I do, who, when I talk about things like parental leave and like, oh, I had 15 weeks for work. Oh my gosh, wouldn't it be so great if everyone had that? They can.
Yeah.
They can. We just have to pay for it. It's not that hard. It wouldn't even cost that much money, honestly.
Right.
So, those are the ways that taxes impact
And it has to be done fairly and equitably, or we're still feeding into the same system.
Yeah, you're just asking
we're
people
just making it work. Like, we're still just going around in the
feedback
cycle.
loop or whatever, kind of like, or the equivalent of that. Yep, no, you're 100% right. Yeah, and so between that and the one thing I like, I'd be remiss if I didn't bring up, because it's like huge part of my work, is tax credit policy. So, and it's not certain kinds that we like to dole out in Louisiana, but things like the child tax credit, right? So that expired at the end of 2021. We're now really getting the full grasp of research on what that did for families and kids. And I mean, poverty was cut in half overnight because of the child tax credit. If you think of the families who they've spoken to thousands of families who have talked about the impact that something like that had on their sanity.
Right.
Just like having the money to make ends meet month to month. And then now it's gone now. It's gone. And we just plunged, twice as many kids into poverty overnight because of it. The child tax credit is a huge piece of tax policy that I work on, and states are starting to enact them too. So Louisiana doesn't have one, but like Minnesota just passed one. It's $1,750 per child. After you make like about 40 grand, it starts to phase out. But yeah, so that's what families in Minnesota are going to be getting now on their state taxes back. And it's going to do wonders for those families in staying housed and keeping the lights on, and like I said, keeping their, fixing that car tire so they can make the next shift and aren't fired from their work. And then all of a sudden, like, disconnected from like unemployment. Like, it just, yeah, it's a really simple policy. Most other, again, developed nations have some sort of like child allowance type thing. And yeah, that's just a huge piece of like helping people stay afloat, like literally and mentally, as they're trying to raise kids. And we're going to see that pay off for generations to come when those policies are enacted. So yeah, like I said, that's just a piece of like tying it all together, right? Like I think, I'm going to this is how I'm going to wrap that part up. Okay. We have a tendency in this country to really focus on individualism, right? Like what am I not doing? Like, oh, like, well, we don't need to like systemically help them. Like if people can just like go, I don't know, like go to the food bank or whatever if they need help. Like there's these things choices that they can make. It doesn't have to be like that. And I think for many, decades now, we've seen that that's like a failing system compared to actually leveraging, the policies that we know work because they've worked in other countries for decades, in creating this system that lifts up all families and kids. And it's when those things happen, we're going to see a huge shift in the mental health of children, the mental health of families. We talked about it earlier, but like, yeah, like you can't dig yourself out of depression when you're laying awake at night wondering if like that eviction notice is going to be posted on your door the next morning. And that obviously, like, there's depression in the instance of like a chemical imbalance, despite the surroundings. Lots of people experience that, just as a mental health illness. But so many people in this country are anxious. Families are experiencing anxiety, are experiencing depression, and some of it could be due to a chemical imbalance, or they could just be predisposed to it. But the situations that we're forcing them to live in, that we've created, because like I want to make it very clear to like poverty is a policy choice. Other nations have nearly eradicated it. We reduced it by half with the child tax credit overnight. Like it's a choice to keep this many people in poverty. And when we make that choice, we can't then just asking them as like individuals to like seek counseling, get on medication, like all those things are helpful, but it's not going to pull you out of making the minimum, it's not going to make you happy.
No.
And
And in that case,
yeah.
it's not even, yes, you probably have depressive symptoms and anxiety symptoms, but it's because you're having a reaction, a normal expected reaction to the environment that you've been forced to live in.
Yeah.
Or try to survive in.
Exactly. Like you are forced into like fight or flight 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I can't imagine living like that. And if you, and if anyone thinks that they could like be in that situation and like have a different outcome, like you're wrong.
You're
wrong.
Yes.
Like there's a reason this many people are struggling with these issues. It's and we are choosing to maintain that status quo. It doesn't have to be like that. So, yeah.
Yeah. You're right. And so that was probably also kind of the answer to this question. But as we wrap up here, if someone just fast forwards to the end of this, they're like, oh, I don't have an hour. They have 5 minutes to listen. What would be the one thing that you would want people to take away from this episode?
Ooh.
It'd be more than one thing, but in a nice little.
I feel like I can sum this up though into like I think the main thing that we hit on really was that societal expectations in terms of especially gender roles are creating a system like internally in the homes and on a larger scale systemically in terms of like what kind of policies we create as a country. These things are choices, and they are lingering from like decades and decades of like what we as a country believed women should be doing, and in terms of like our roles in the home and our roles for child rearing. And my main takeaway is that like it's still a choice to like reinforce these policies and these systems and these types of like ideal nuclear families that the vast majority of people don't even fit into. And we don't have to do that anymore. We can easily we could overnight elect a bunch of people who support completely different policies and systems, and could create a nation that prioritizes things like a meaningful parental leave and a child tax credit that helps families, weather expenses and economic kind of like surprises and keeps their family afloat. And all of these things, when we fix these systems, is going to have we're going to see a drastic shift on mental health for generations. People are better parents when they have everyone wants to be a good parent. Yeah. Like everyone has a kid and no one's like, I want to screw all of this up. I want to be terrible. Like everyone wants to be a good parent and they want to raise successful, smart children. But only a fraction of the people in this country, especially this state, have the tools readily accessible